reveal London at night. The fog obscures the stone streets, the lamps glow darkly, and behind the inconspicuous doors there is another light, soft, warm, reminiscent of the sweet smell of resin light. Tired people joke in silence, and not in the heat of the moment. Today we are falling apart in the rain, not a lot more expensive than the opium-like rooms of Victorian England. A place where we become a prayer, and silence becomes a prayer. Sit with your hands. The light is already dark, and our story begins. Good evening, dear listener. First of all, we would like to ask you to take a light breath, so breathless that you can feel the ice. Allow yourself to leave behind the exhausted work, the unfinished work, the voices of other people's thoughts, which sometimes obsessively accompany the silence. And as you should expect, these nightly excursions to the world of ancient sounds, quiet rituals, forgotten human sensibilities, and super-kind sounds of the era. I will thank you for subscribing to the channel. Our story today is about what in Victorian England was called burdened malt, dark lush, dark open, or licorice fog. About chicken opium, but not in that booming, dramatic, over-the-top sense with which he is often portrayed in the movies and newspapers during these hours. We are not talking about screams, tragedies, and poignant stories. The stories of the past are not made for anyone. We are crumbling quietly, willingly, taking in the atmosphere, the ritual, the routine, the observation. All those who know from memory are still alive in the shadow of the past. It will be more expensive to get to London at the end of the 19th century, but not to the loud streets with clattering carriages, not to the great storefronts of the West End, not to the black and white saw factories. We know a different London. The halls, the ice of the light, the icy fog, with narrow passages and invisible doors, behind which the shadows of other people's worlds hid the converging edge of London. A place where the smell of the sea mixes with the smell of sawdust and spices that arrive from ships. Here at night, you can meet sailors from China, Burmese porters, Indian priests, as well as thousands of Britons who came to marvel at the exotic, about which the newspapers write so much. There was only one little noise in the middle of the noise, where the world was buzzing wooden doors with worn-out panels. An inconspicuous sign or appearance. The small window allows warmth and lightness to seep through, not at all like a cold London evening. When the doors open quietly, the first thing you smell is the aroma. Warm, sweet, thick, but not harsh. An aroma that is unlike anything else. It looks like it's rotten, but soft. Reminds me of caramelized zucchor, or darker one. Guessing a distantly exotic resin, I'll never have a chance to hold it in my hands. The wine burns you so softly that you would like to throw a vest over your shoulder and warm the carpet. The room may be completely quiet. The light of the caudle glows with a pale light, which initially floats in the afterglow. The walls were decorated with cheap reproductions of Chinese landscapes sold in the markets of Whitechapel. On the underside there are old keels, which fade the sound of the blood. A dozen people lie on low couches, propped up on pillows with flowered dragons. The stench won't go away. Not at all. The stench is present between thought and death, between day and nothing, between every hour and every day. This is what the English newspapers called an opium den looked like. However, the word brothel creates a harsh, rude feeling of hostility. Those who know the truth will soon remember a small monastery of silence, where people do not run away from reality, but try to escape from it. The Victorian lifestyle was brutal, morally, economically, socially. People worked for 12 to 16 years. The place was choking in the fog, and smog class systems limited matrimony within strict limits. and between evil and wealth, a break that seemed endless. And in this interruption, people were munching on eggplant, wanting to feel a little better. I would like to forget about the fight. I wish I had a lot of warmth, but I was not destined to know it in real life. That's why people came here, not necessarily for malt often, for silence. But the ritual of the opium hen was not similar to anything else. We will be relaxed and perhaps meditative. There was a lamp in the center of the room. It was small, with a metal bowl, with a thick fire that gave off a roaring, warm fire. The handrail is long tubes, curved, decorated with splits, but the real mystery lay not in the pipe, but in the preparation of opium. It was heated on a ceramic spoon, slowly, carefully. A drop of resin began to soften. It changed color from dark brown to amber. A small ball, called a button, became a narrow bundle of sweet smoke. It was carefully placed in a bowl on a tube, brought to the lamp. The smoke was not born abruptly. It seeped like the breath of old wood in warm air. The person inhaled slowly, almost motionless, as if listening to his own heart, as if listening to space. Outside, London was noisy. Carriages rattled with wheels, factories banged, people quarreled. Someone was detained by the police, ships blared their sirens. But here, none of this existed. Here everything flowed like a warm, sweet fog, softly, slowly, imperceptibly. Therefore, for some Victorians, opium rooms became not a symbol of vice, but a refuge, a place where you could stop being someone, a worker, a wife, a mother, a clerk, a sailor, a writer, and simply be yourself, only a body and a mind dissolving in the semi-darkness. Of course, society did not approve of this. Victorian morality was strict, uncompromising. Terrible articles appeared in newspapers, terrible descriptions of destroyed souls, lost Englishmen, who, they say, had turned into a shadow. These texts often sounded xenophobic. The Chinese were portrayed as seducers, as people who bring poison. But the reality, as always, was more complicated. Many Chinese immigrants worked here hard, honestly, modestly, and opium rooms were more likely quiet places of rest than dens of sin. Even many Englishmen who had been here remembered these places quite differently. They spoke of the warmth of the lamp, of the silence, of how the smoke reminded them of distant memories from childhood, of a strange, soft sleep that did not cause fear, of the opportunity to be alone with one's thoughts in a world that did not tolerate either weakness or slowness. And therein lies the paradox of the Victorian era, a society that prided itself on progress, industry, and scientific achievements, at the same time created one of the loneliest generations of Englishmen. And these lonely people sought their corners of silence, sometimes in books, sometimes in music, sometimes in religion, and sometimes in the warm haze of opium smoke. When we talk about Victorian England and its hidden passions, it is important to understand that none of them arose suddenly. None of them appeared from nothing. Everything that happened in the 19th century had a long shadow of the past, stretching back centuries. And opium, that sweet, thick resin that filled rooms with warm smoke, also had its own path. A path that began long before lamps and porcelain pipes. Imagine not England, but a completely different world. Hot, sunny, smelling of resin and earth. Ancient civilizations knew about poppies centuries before the Victorians learned to heat opium in lamps. Archaeologists find evidence. Clay vessels depicting ripe poppy heads, carved almost with tenderness. Egyptian priests kept opium tinctures next to honey essences. Greek doctors considered it a gift from the gods. Even Hippocrates, the father of medicine, wrote about it as a painkiller. But all these ancient rituals were just a preface. The real act was when opium left the hot fields and set off across the seas. Ships sailing from east to west carried spices, fabrics, tea, and among them were brown lumps of resin wrapped in leaves. When the resin arrived in Britain, no one saw anything strange in it. It was not forbidden. It was not a vice. On the contrary, it was welcomed. The English of that time loved effective painkillers. And in a world where medicine did not yet know anesthesia, antibiotics, or painkillers in the modern sense, opium seemed like a miracle. An 18th, 19th century pharmacy, wooden shelves, dark bottles with glass stoppers, labels handwritten in calligraphic script, the scents of menthol, camphor, wax, and alcohol. And among them, small vials of dark brown liquid. This is laudanum. Doctors prescribed it as easily as they prescribe paracetamol today. It was dripped into water, added to a shot of wine, even mixed into tea. And it was commonplace. Absolutely commonplace. No one looked at opium as a danger. It was medicine, nothing more. But how did this pharmacy substance later turn into a shadow that frightened Victorian morality? To understand, you need to look even deeper into that time. Imagine a London pharmacy in the 1830s. Behind the counter stands the pharmacist, a gray-haired man in an apron. Leafing through his recipe book, he mixes tinctures like an artist mixes paints. There are dozens of recipes in the book, and almost everyone contains a drop or two of opium. People come to him with a wide variety of problems, from coughs to broken hearts. Victorian doctors sincerely believed that opium soothed not only the body, but also the soul. Not because they were ignorant, but because there was no alternative. Medical universities of that time had strict rules and old-fashioned education. Future doctors memorized Latin, anatomy, theories of humors, which had already lost their relevance. But about addiction, the chemical nature of habit, the destructive effects of certain substances, no one knew then or did not want to know. Therefore, laudanum was a salvation for everyone. For mothers who did not know how to calm their babies, for men whose psyche was broken by industrialization, for women exhausted by housework, social prohibitions, and unexpressed feelings, for writers who lived on the verge of creative breakdowns. History remembers many. Jane Austen drank laudanum for pain. Lord Byron carried it in a bottle in his pocket. Samuel Taylor Coleridge created under its influence. De Quincey glorified laudanum in his Confessions of an Englishman Who Used Opium. All of them saw nothing wrong with it. It was simply a means that made their journey easier. But gradually, the situation changed. Because England began to look towards China, not as a romantic traveler, but as an empire. And when an empire pays attention to something, it usually doesn't see the subtleties, only the benefits. Opium became part of a big game, a game that brought wealth to England and tragedy to China. But we'll talk about the war later. Today, something else is important to us. The British began to perceive opium differently, not because they knew about its harm, but because they suddenly saw its alien face. Up until then, opium had been a European medicine. Now it began to be associated with China, with exoticism, with otherness, with things they didn't understand, but which they feared. And it was then that horror stories began to creep into the newspapers, not about laudanum, which respectable Englishmen drank, but about smoking opium, which supposedly dragged souls to the bottom. But in reality, everything was much simpler. There was China, where opium smoking became part of the culture. There was England, which imported all this culture along with its goods, and there were sailors who brought habits to the banks of the Thames. There were immigrants who opened their own establishments, peaceful, quiet, without pathos, there were Britons who encountered a different way of life for the first time. And there was an incredible human curiosity, as old as the history of mankind. It was this curiosity that led people into small rooms with lamps. It was this curiosity that led them to smoking and not to despair or vice. It was this curiosity that made them try, smell, inhale, observe. But along with curiosity came another feeling, the feeling of forbidden space. Where there is a secret, a myth always appears, and myths began to be born. To understand the atmosphere of those myths, imagine the living room of an average Victorian family. On the wall is an engraving depicting India. On the shelf is a Chinese vase. On the table is a box of tea from Canton. Society at that time craved everything exotic, but at the same time was terribly afraid of it. Therefore, opium, which came from warm lands, became both a fashionable novelty and an object of fear. This dual attitude created the ground for future legends about the underground London. But legends are one thing. Reality is completely different. The British began to be embarrassed about opium smokers precisely when laudanum began to spread so much that it began to cause imperceptible addiction in respectable, educated, respectable people. And instead of recognizing this problem, society transferred fear to another, to the Oriental way of consumption. It always happens that when the truth is too close, people look for shade further away. Opium, which had entered British homes so peacefully, quietly, and imperceptibly in the form of laudanum, had a completely different face, where it was born and grew. In China, there it turned into a storm, into an abyss, into a war that changed the fate of millions. Imagine China in the 18th and 19th centuries, a country of grandiose imperial palaces, where porcelain glitters in the sun like ice, a country of rice fields stretching to the horizon, a country of calligraphers, tea ceremonies, misty mountains, where clouds hang between the pines like slow dreams. And at the same time, a country that did not want to trade with the outside world. Not because it was arrogant or closed, but because it had enough of its own goods, its own culture, its own history. China did not need anything from Europe. But Europe, oh, how it needed China. It needed tea, silk, porcelain. Entire industries were built on these goods. The English tea ritual, so familiar today, was dependent on Chinese supplies. British chests filled with porcelain went to the homes of the elite, and every cup was part of the imperial appetite. There was only one problem. China wanted almost nothing in return. The trade was one-sided, and Britain began to lose silver. A lot of silver. This caused panic in the offices of London, and this is where opium entered the scene. Not as a medicine, not as a painkiller, but as a commodity. If you listen carefully to history, every imperial tragedy begins quietly, with the creak of a diplomat's pen signing a treaty, or with negotiations in a stuffy room where heavy curtains block out the light. That's exactly what happened with opium. The British East India Company, a state within a state, a monster with its own army, navy, and government, was looking for a way to balance the trade balance, and it found it in India, a colony that was already suffering from British control. There, in the fields of Bengal, they began to grow poppies en masse. There, in stone buildings, the resin was boiled, dried, and pressed into briquettes. There, under the scorching sun, peasants worked until they were exhausted so that British merchant ships could send these briquettes east, and to the east was China. In a country where emperors banned opium, it still seeped into the ports. In a country where officials tried to protect the people from addiction, British ships stood in the bays like seductive ghosts. In a country that valued order, opium dens sprang up one after another. Opium was forbidden, but it was profitable. Officials took bribes. Smugglers worked at night ships, came again and again. It wasn't romance, it was economics. Sometimes the most terrifying stories begin like this. Imagine a night in the port of Canton. Lanterns reflect on the water. The air is warm, thick, and smells of the sea and the wood of ships' sides. Somewhere, a captain is cursing quietly. Somewhere, a Chinese man in a silk cape is writing down the weight of the goods. And a little further away, an English agent stands with brutal certainty in his eyes. He knows the opium will sell. He knows it will be paid for in silver. He knows the empire approves of his work. Thus is the story of addiction created. And thus begins the story of conflict. For every action has a consequence. And when the British filled their holds with silver, they did not see that they were filling China with pain. Finally, the Qing emperor said, "Enough." In 1839, he appointed General Lin Zexu, a man of extraordinary honor and wisdom, to stop the opium trade, and Lin took this task as his sacred duty. He wrote a letter to the British Queen, a long, polite, deeply moral letter in which he asked, "If this substance is harmful, why do you sell it to us? If it is harmless, why do you ban it from your country?" Queen Victoria did not answer. History is silent, but this silence became louder than any cry. Then Lin ordered the confiscation and destruction of opium in the port of Guangzhou. 20,000 chests, more than a ton of tar. Everything was dumped into the sea. It was an act of defense, but Britain took it as an insult. And war began. The First Opium War was not heroic. There were no great battles that would become legends. There were no generals whose glory would shine for centuries. It was a war of gunboats against arrows, a war of the imperial machine against an old state that was not ready for Western weapons, a war where the outcome was decided before the first shot was fired. But despite this, behind every battle, there were people. Chinese soldiers who fought for honor, British sailors who often did not understand what they were fighting for, women and children in coastal villages who woke up to the roar of cannons, traveling traders who lost everything. When the war ended, China was forced to sign the Treaty of Nanjing. It was called unequal, and it was. China opened its ports to trade. It paid huge indemnities. It gave Hong Kong to Britain. And the cruelest thing is that opium was not banned. On the contrary, it became a legal route into the empire. This is how you create dependence, not on the people, but on the state. The Second Opium War only made things worse. Diplomats talked about politics. Newspapers wrote about the civilization of the East. But behind every word, there was a shadow. The shadow of the tar sacks that were sailing to the Chinese shores. London knew about it. London discussed it. There were even those in London who protested, priests, thinkers, mothers. But their voices were lost in the corridors of power. And yet the wars have changed opium. They have given it a new image, not of medicine, but of weapon, not of support, but of destruction, not of a home remedy, but of imperial stain. Now imagine an evening in a British home in the 1850s. Outside the window it is raining. Wood is crackling in the fireplace. A family is sitting in the living room, reading a newspaper. On the front page is news from China. The government is falling. The people are suffering. The imperial ships are returning. And on the table is a bottle of laudanum, the same opium, the same smell, the same sweet drop that the mother drips into a glass to help her fall asleep. A strange duality, as if two realities exist side by side and do not notice each other. Opium in Britain is a home doctor. Opium in China is a destroyer of states. It was after the war that horror stories began to emerge in England. Newspapers painted pictures that had never been seen before. Writers described denats, in which the English lost their souls. Artists created images of Chinese tempters who lured victims into darkness. And the stronger this guilt, the more terrible the myths became. London in the Victorian era was a city of contrasts, noisy, stuffy, continuous. But among this gigantic mechanism of stone, iron, steam pipes, and human footsteps, there were places that were hardly spoken of aloud. Places that were entered quietly and never given addresses. Places that did not advertise themselves, had no signs, no bells, no bright lights. These were opium dens, not like in Conan Doyle's short stories or newspaper sensationalism. The city had completely different stories, quieter, softer, more human. Imagine an evening in the 1870s. The air is cold, damp, but not scary. It smells of smoke, wood, the sea, old boots, wet newspapers that vendors spread out under streetlights. Somewhere in the street, the cry of a newspaper echoes in a distant echo. Fog over the Thames. News of the day. Horse-drawn carriages roll slowly, leaving wet tracks behind them. Another policeman in a greatcoat passes nearby, nodding to his own thoughts. Horse-drawn carriages roll slowly, leaving wet tracks behind them. Another policeman in a greatcoat passes nearby, nodding to his own thoughts. And you turn into an alley that not everyone knows. Its name is not in the guidebooks. It seems to be created in order to hide something in it. Narrow, with dark, silent facades. The lamps are rarely lit here, and those that are lit have a dim light, as if the flame is afraid to wake the night. At the end of the alley is a wooden door, old, simple, rubbed to a shine where they have been touched by hands. The first breath of air inside is soft, warm, unhurried. The smell of opium is immediately recognizable. It is sweet but not obtrusive, like the aroma of old saffron or warm wood after rain. It does not hit the head immediately, does not twist, does not cut. On the contrary, it envelops, softly, carefully, like a warm scarf thrown over the shoulders. The lighting here is different from that in the city. They do not know about the harsh London gas fire. Here, oil lamps shine, yellow, muffled, with small, fragile tongues of flame that tremble with every movement. They create shadows on the walls that look like waves. These shadows move so slowly that it seems as if they too are dozing. The walls of the room are decorated with cheap but meticulous copies of Chinese engravings. Mountains in the mist, pines on the peaks, small boats on the rivers, pagodas carved into the cloudy sky. This is not real art, not luxury, but only an attempt to create another world, a world where time flows more slowly. On the floor are long, faded carpets, brought by unfortunate sailors from distant lands. On them lie pillows, not quite clean, but carefully straightened. The newspapers wrote that the opium dens were a place of decadence. But the truth is much calmer. Not only the lost came here. Those who simply needed a break came tired dock workers who worked 12 to 14 hours a day, loading bags, boxes, barrels. Their backs have long since lost their sense of lightness. For them, a warm room was peace, not vice old sailors who brought the habit of smoking from China, Bengal, Singapore. They were not looking for escape, only for the familiar smell that reminded them of years of travel. English gentlemen who wore frock coats and high collars during the day and wanted silence in the evening. They came alone, tired from work in offices, banks, law firms. They lay down on pillows and listened silently to their own thoughts, which finally became quiet. Women. Less often, but still. lonely maids who worked without days off, widows who had lost their husbands in naval battles, seamstresses whose hands ached from needles, sometimes even respectable ladies who knew no other way to relieve fatigue than laudanum or smoke. The Chinese who opened these establishments. For them, smoking opium was part of the culture, not a holy place, not a vice, but simply a way to be alone, to relieve pain, to talk to silence. In the center of the room stood a lamp. It was important, almost sacred. Nearby sat a lamp man, a person who made sure that the temperature was even, stable. If the lamp burned too hot, the opium would burn too quickly. If it was cold, the resin would not soften. This work required patience. And patience was the main language here. Near the lamp lay long tubes. They were most often curved, made of bamboo, with porcelain bowls inlaid with small ornaments. Some were simple, worn. Some were real works of art. The process began with a small dark ball, a button. It was made of resin, which was preheated on a metal spoon. Then the button was inserted into a porcelain bowl. The tube was slowly brought to the flame. When the opium touched the heat, it began to sing. It made a quiet sound, shh, as if someone were putting a hot drop on a frying pan. And this sound calmed many. The smoke rose slowly, as if it did not want to disturb the air. It was not thick, like tobacco. It was lighter, paler, almost transparent. Its smell was warm, delicate, sometimes slightly sweet. From the outside, the British imagined these places quite differently. Newspapers painted scenes of decay. People were supposedly lying in heaps, unconscious, in agony. Writers created fantastic stories about crimes, about kidnappings, about bad Chinese who are dragging the English into ruin. But in reality, the night in these rooms was closer to meditation than to chaos. Here, you could be left alone. For the first time in a week, a month, a year, people lay silent. Some dozed. Some looked at the wall, where the shadow from the lamp resembled a mountain in the fog. Some searched for thoughts that they had not dared to hear for a long time, and no one disturbed this delicate state. British fantasy created the myth of day, and reality was a room of silence. Victorian England was the age of writing, the age of diaries, letters, poems, novels, newspapers, pamphlets. And there was one material background in this literary storm. Opium not always smoked, more often drunk in the form of laudanum. But the effect is the same. A slow wave of warmth that envelops thought, muffles the edge of reality, opening the door to another world. Imagine a writer of the Victorian era. His room is small, the table is wooden, worn, a fountain pen lies next to the inkwell. The paper creaks under his fingers, a candle crackles, casting trembling shadows on the ceiling. The writer sits with his head resting on his hands. Not because he doesn't know what to write about, on the contrary. There are too many thoughts. They make a noise like the London fog that can't be cleared. He needs silence inside himself, so he opens the bottle. He drips a few drops. He mixes it with cold water. He drinks and waits. Minutes pass, and suddenly, with everything becomes softer, the sharp corners of the world disappear. The voice of anxiety falls silent. The words that used to jump and tangle will lie on the page in even lines. This is how many of those we read today worked. They were not addicts in the modern sense. They were people who sought inner space. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, a poet of fog and smoke. One of the most famous was Coleridge, the author of Kubla Khan, a poem that he himself called a dream. He was often ill, often suffering from pain, from nervous conditions, from depression, which at that time could neither be diagnosed nor treated. Laudanum was his medicine. And at the same time, a guide to dreams. Imagine his night. January. The wind howls in the window frame. A flame smolders in the fireplace. Coleridge sits, wrapped in a blanket, his fingers cold, his heart heavy. He drinks opium tincture, and thoughts begin to melt like ice in the palm of his hand. Thomas de Quincey is the first to dare to speak out loud. In 1821, the world was stunned by the book Confessions of an English Opium User. Written by Thomas de Quincey, it was the first attempt to honestly describe the opium experience. But do not think that this was an incriminating text. No. It was a confession. And a confession is always quiet, sincere, painful. De Quincey described two sides of opium. The side of the day, when everything looked clearer, more beautiful, when London seemed a city of gold and silver, when every sound became music. And the side of the night, of hungry nightmares, shadows that haunted dreams, anxieties that were born in the darkness. But the scariest thing in his text is not even the fears. The scariest thing is loneliness. Victorian society did not like to talk about women who touched opium, but there were many of them. Sometimes much more than men. Because women in that era had it harder. Mental conditions that today are called depression or anxiety were then called nerves, hysteria, feminine weakness. And they were treated, of course, with laudanum. Charlotte Brontë wrote about stomach aches and headaches that she relieved with opium drops. Elizabeth Barrett Browning was given opium after a spinal injury and could not sleep without it for years. Dickens's Nellie Ternan, the actress and lover of the writer, also turned to the tincture when life was too much to bear. Victorian artists were particularly sensitive people. Many of them worked at night when the world was softer. Opium helped them relax their bodies, but not their minds. On the contrary, it dissolved the filters between reality and fantasy. Opium did not give them genius. It gave them perception, sensation, a gentle shift in perspective. In British museums, you can find paintings in which the shadows on the walls look not quite real, as if the light enveloped the objects like a warm mist. This is not evidence of opium, but this is a sign of the era. If you listen carefully to the rhythm of Victorian literature and art, you can feel a certain common note, a note of fatigue, a note of seeking relief, a note of fighting one's own demons, a note of strange reverie. Is it all due to opium? No. You can't drink genius. You can't inhale beauty with smoke. But opium gave some people what they didn't have in their own lives. Silence. Opium as a mirror of the soul. For many creative people, opium became a mirror, sometimes clear, sometimes distorted. It did not invent images, it only expanded feelings. It did not give talent, it only opened doors. But doors can lead to both a garden and an abyss. Why did some artists create masterpieces, while others disappeared into the darkness? This remained a mystery of the human psyche. Creativity has always been a dangerous thing. Opium only intensified this. The Victorian era knew how to hide pain. It knew how to cover up emotions with harsh manners. It knew how to be silent where it was necessary to shout opium. This sweet, silent resin had two faces. One was gentle, warm, almost kind. The other, dark, quiet, invisible. Everything always began the same way, and always, innocently. A person was sick, toothache, migraine, insomnia, female cramps, nervous tension, postpartum depression, anxiety, which was then called weakness of the heart. And the doctor would say, "Drink some laudanum." It sounded as ordinary as today. Drink some painkiller. The person drank a few drops, and the pain receded. The head became light. Sleep came without a struggle, and no one would have suspected the danger. For how could something that helped so well be harmful? Today we speak of drug addiction as a scientific fact. In Victorian times, this concept did not exist. They did not know the term. They did not understand the mechanism. They could not explain why the body asked again and again. They only saw the symptoms, and they tried to describe them in old words. Nervous exhaustion, periodic attacks of weakness, weak spirit, melancholy, dispersion of thoughts, strange nightmares. A modern doctor would recognize this immediately, but a Victorian did not see cause and effect relationships. A person drank laudanum for a headache, the next time for insomnia, once again from sadness, again from nerves. And suddenly, one day, without the tincture, the head splits, the legs weaken, the hands tremble, the heart beats restlessly. The person thinks, "This is an illness. I am simply sick," and takes a bottle from the shelf, and the pain instantly passes. Isn't this proof that the medicine works? So thought the Victorian. He did not understand that the body asks not for relief from pain, but for a repetition of the effect. Among all the stories of Victorian addiction, the most dramatic were the stories of women, because a woman at that time had no right to a voice. She had no right to complain. She was called the angel of the house. But angels do not get hurt. Women took laudanum for insomnia, for menstrual pain, for nervous breakdowns, for postpartum pain, for emotional trauma, for domestic violence that could not be mentioned. They were prescribed tonics, calming drops, nerve elixirs, all with opium. And the women did not notice that they were becoming addicted because their symptoms were explained in other words. Feminine weakness, hysteria, fatigue, nerves. And they lived in a trap. Silent, slow, invisible. Victorian medicine, despite the enormous development of anatomy and surgery, had one weakness: it almost did not understand the psyche, and even less, addiction. A person who complained of insomnia was given more opium. A person who was trembling was given more concentrated drops. A person who was depressed was given double doses. Sometimes the doctors themselves did not notice that they were making the patient addicted. They were convinced that they were treating him. And this is the most terrible shadow of age. What did the beginning of addiction look like? Very mildly, the person became drowsy, then easily irritated. Then a strange state appeared, as if something was pressing in the soul, but it did not hurt. There was a desire to be alone, then insomnia, then tremors, then sweating, then outbursts of anxiety. But all these symptoms were interpreted by the Victorians as city jitters, overwork, bad blood, melancholy, unhappy temperament. Nobody said addiction. And no one knew what to do. Many addicts' diaries contain the same entries. I'm afraid to fall asleep. The shadows in my dreams move too slowly. I see sounds. I wake up in a sweat and don't know who I am. Eyes I've never seen in my life look at me at night. Opium dreams were very different. Some were beautiful, others were terrible. The first came on days of taking, the second came on days without opium. Opium not only calmed me down, it distorted the rhythm of the brain. And when the substance was gone, dreams broke like cracked porcelain. A person would wake up screaming, but tell no one, because the Victorians didn't share such things. It was an individual, quiet horror. The most painful thing about the history of opium is that there were addicts in every class. The rich, the poor, the middle class, women, men, the old, the young. But no one spoke about it out loud, because Victorian morality did not allow it. Medical attempts at treatment. They treated addiction with opium, smaller doses, other forms, slow reduction, This rarely helped. Sometimes the following treatments were offered: cold baths, physical work, being in the fresh air. This could alleviate the condition, but it did not solve the problem. Because the problem was not in the person's will and not in morality, and not in strength of mind. The problem was in the body's chemistry, which was not known at the time. There are cities that live a double life. One life is daytime, visible, full of movement, market, politics, everyday life, noise, affairs. The other is nocturnal, invisible, semi-verbal. Victorian London was just such a city. Victorian England was the age of newspapers. London printing houses worked like factories. Newspapers were published morning, afternoon, evening. Each of them was looking for news, bright headlines, loud stories. People wanted drama, although their lives were already difficult. They wanted excitement that could be read safely in an armchair. Editors knew fear sells better than the truth, and everything incomprehensible can easily be turned into a threat. Therefore, the first mentions of opium rooms in newspapers were completely different from the reality that we saw in the previous sections, and the newspapers wrote, "The hellish pits of the East in the heart of London. Englishmen losing their souls in smoke. Victims of Chinese evil. Traps for young gentlemen." They painted pictures they had never seen. They described scenes that resembled religious nightmares. Dark rooms, light only from a lamp. People lying on the floor, having lost their will. Chinese hosts laughing ominously. A fog that drags guests into the abyss. This was not reportage. This was horror literature. But millions of people believed them. Fear rarely arises from a vacuum. It grows on the soil of experience, historical, psychological, cultural. And the British fear of opium had several roots, and the first was imperial guilt. The British knew, though they rarely admitted it, that they had themselves turned opium into a weapon in China. And what arouses guilt always becomes a shadow. When the first Chinese immigrants arrived in London and established their cozy smoking rooms, the English saw in those rooms not a home, not a ritual, not a tradition. They saw a reflection of war, and that was frightening. The second was ignorance of another culture. Chinese culture was a mystery to the Victorians. Everything in it seemed alien, incomprehensible, exotic, unexpected. What is incomprehensible easily seems dangerous. The third was a substitution for one's own pain. Hundreds of thousands of Englishmen were addicted to laudanum. But no one wanted to admit that the problem was their own. It was more convenient to say, "People are suffering because of the Eastern way, not because of our favorite bottle on the shelf." This is how a myth is created. Newspapers told about rooms where people lost their humanity. Crimes under the influence of fog were committed. Perversion and vice reigned unchecked. It sounded scary. But the most interesting thing is that all this was created in newspaper editorial offices, not in reality. Opium rooms, as we know, where quiet people dozed there, lay down, contemplated shadows, shared stories about distant China or their own fatigue. But newspapers saw a trap in the silence. Therefore, newspapers invented monsters because they could not describe the fear of reality. Writers of Victorian England picked up newspaper legends. Dickens, Conan Doyle, Oscar Wilde, even they, described opium dens not as they looked, but as their readers wanted to see them. Somber, sharp, cinematic. Imagine the scene. A detective entering the darkness, a man lying unconscious, a sinister Chinese man controlling everything, a fog billowing near the floor. These are images made for literature, not history. But people believed, and the myth became more real than the smoke. In Victorian England, the middle class was the most anxious they constantly needed. to be decent, to be right, to be honest, to be normal. And their fear of their own reputation made them extremely vulnerable to legends. They believed that opium dens were places where souls were lost, because they feared their own weaknesses. They feared that their children might end up there. They feared that their own inclinations might lead them there. Fear is always stronger when it is hidden. Imagine yourself on a narrow street, where the stones under your feet still retain moisture from the evening rain. The fog hangs over the ground in light strands, wrapping the lanterns, making them look like ghostly balls of light. At the end of the street is a familiar door. It doesn't look significant, but it draws you in, like a hidden entrance to another world. You push it. It opens slowly, as if someone is whispering. Come in quietly. The night is different here. The first step inside, and the air changes. It's warm here. The smell of smoke is not sharp, but soft, like steam from warm milk. The smell of old wood, the smell of a lamp, the smell of spices that Chinese sailors carry with them in tight canvas bags. The sounds of the city remain outside, as if the closed door blocks reality itself. Only silence, and the soft crackle of a lamp. There is no bright light in the room. Here are a few oil lamps, like small suns, hanging low above the ground. The light is yellow, as if dusty. It touches faces, making them softer. It touches shadows, making them deeper. Reflections slowly waver on the walls, the kind that remind you of waves on a quiet sea. Time flows here. In this light, seconds seem longer. Every movement is in slow motion. You sit down on a low couch, the pillow on which smells of other people's dreams, not unpleasant, just human. Around you are a few people who have come earlier. In the center of the room sits the lamp man, a man who knows the ritual down to the smallest detail. His movements are precise, unhurried, like an ancient gesture. In front of him is a lamp, a spoon, a small piece of resin that looks like ambergris. He takes a portion of opium, heats it over the flame, rotates it as if forming a small star. You hear a quiet sound. The opium softens, begins to stretch like a thin thread. It is a sound that relieves tension, the sound that opens the night. When the button is ready, he puts it in the bowl of the pipe. He holds it up to the lamp and gently hands it to you. You inhale, slowly. The smoke enters the lungs not like poison, but like a warm dream. Its taste is delicate, tart, sweetish. The feeling is not euphoria, but as if someone has stroked the inside of the chest. The light seems softer. The internal noise subsides. The words in your head stop running. You take another breath. And again, a pause. After a few puffs, time changes its course. It no longer runs. It does not stand still. It floats like a river in the fog. You look at the lamp, and the flame seems alive. It does not just glow, but speaks something very quietly. You hear every sound. Someone moving a cushion on the couch, how the old floor creaks under someone's foot, how the kettle in the corner exhales steam, how the lamp man carefully touches the resin with a spoon. This is not noise. This is music. Even the shadow moves with the rhythm. The Chinese engravings on the walls seem to come to life. It seems that the mountains breathe on them, and the boats float, not a hallucination, not a delusion, just a soft perception of the world. As the opium begins to take effect more deeply, the world recedes even further. You are not asleep, but you are not awake either. This is a state in between, somewhere in the middle between reality and a dream. In this state, thoughts dissolve like sugar in tea. The body feels light, soft, relaxed. Fears subside. The past seems distant. The future is not scary. You notice that you have been looking at the pattern on the carpet for 10 minutes, and each turn of the thread seems like a story. You see shapes in the shadows that resemble people, mountains, trees. Not brightly, not clearly, but gently, like the outlines of dreams that disappear when you wake up. Someone's laughter from the other corner sounds muffled, as if through a pair of thick walls you feel that your body is like a boat in a calm bay. It sways, it doesn't sink, it doesn't move. It just is. As the night draws to a close, the lamp man prepares the last buttons. His movements become even slower. He heats the resin like a sculptor carving a small work of art. The last puff is always the most tender, like a farewell to the night. The smoke smells of warmth and solitude. It smells of silence. It smells of oblivion about everything that will wait outside the door. No era can sleep forever. Not even the one that tries to hide its fears behind thick curtains of morality. And its pains in bottles of dark glass, Victorian England walked a long, narrow path between silence and self-deception. Opium was for it what a soft pillow is for a weary traveler. It soothed, but did not cure, it approved, but at the same time hid the truth. And one day this truth did knock on the door. In the 1870s and 1880s, people began to appear in Britain who dared to speak out about the dangers of opium. And they were not politicians, not journalists, not the military. They were doctors. The same ones who had been prescribing laudanum for years, not suspecting that they were sending people into quiet addiction. In the diaries of doctors of that time, entries appear. The patient cannot sleep without the tincture. When the dose is reduced, nervous fits. Addiction comes faster than I thought. I think I am to blame for his condition. These were the first steps towards understanding the first cracks in the old system. Victorian doctors did not have modern knowledge, but they had eyes. And they saw weak hands, empty gazes, bodies that were losing weight, minds that were fading, lives that were being squeezed into a small amber bottle. Doctors who had a heart began to sound the alarm. At this time, the churches of England also began to open their eyes. At first, they spoke of moral threats, because that was their tradition. But later, their voices became more human. The sermons included the words, "We must help, not judge. The cause of vice is not the evil of man, but his wound. Don't drink anymore. Talk to me. God sees not the sinner, but the sufferer." The priests in the poor districts of London saw things that the politicians did not see. Women hiding bottles in their aprons. Workers taking opium to get through the workday. Widows taking tinctures to sleep without their husbands. Mothers giving their children drops when they cried at night. They saw that opium was not a sin. Opium was a cry for help. And they began to talk about it. Why was society so late in realizing the truth? Because opium was quiet, because it didn't create drama. Because addicts rarely behaved dangerously. Because most of them were respectable people. And because the Victorians had one very strong belief. If you don't talk about the problem, there isn't one. In 1868, Britain passed its first law regulating the sale of poisonous substances. Opium was one of them. It wasn't a ban, it was a small sign. We're starting to understand. Pharmacies had to record sales. Children weren't allowed to buy. Vendors had to be careful. That was just the beginning. In 1878, a law came out that allowed the police to search suspicious rooms. In the 1880s, a law was passed that restricted the sale of strong tinctures, but these laws weren't about fighting. They were about fear. Society was afraid of the problem it had created. In the 1890s, Britain set up several commissions to study opium. Their reports said, "We cannot ignore the growing addiction among women." In poor areas, Up to 30% of workers use opium regularly. Laudanum should be sold only on prescription. Instructions for doctors are needed. It sounded like belated repentance. It was as if the empire had finally looked itself in the mirror. Medicine had improved. Other painkillers, more controlled, were introduced. Society began to see addicts not as vicious, but as sick. That changed everything. Writers changed their tone. Where they had previously romanticized opium, they now described its dark side. The police did not raid opium dens because they wanted to help addicts. And because I wanted to create an image. We are fighting vice. But they were not fighting there. They persecuted the Chinese rooms because it was easy. Because these were communities that had no voice. Because they were easy to blame, and the Victorian houses with laudanum, they remained untouched. This was not a struggle. This was politics. Despite the hypocrisy, despite the delays, despite the prejudices, there were changes. People began to fear opium less as foreign and more as a chemical, as a medical, as real, as human. In a world where factories hummed incessantly, where class walls were made of iron, where women lived in cages of duty, where men broke their backs at work, where children grew up before they could read, opium was no consolation. It was an outlet. Let's start with them, the people who were the most numerous in Victorian England. Imagine a working day on the docks or in a factory. 12, 14, 16 hours of hard labor. No days off. No insurance. No rest. The worker woke up before dawn. He walked through the fog. He handed boxes, pulled ropes, carried coal. His back broke. His hands cracked from the cold. His knees swelled. His head buzzed from the constant noise. In the evening, when he returned home, he might have a few coins in his pocket. And pain, pain, and pain. The workers had no doctors. They had no money. They had no ways to cope with pain, and they had opium. It was cheap. It was available. It could be bought without a prescription. It relieved pain faster than talking. 1 drop, and the body relaxes for several hours. 2, and the head stops remembering fatigue. 3, and you can sleep without thoughts. For a worker, opium was not a luxury. It was the only painkiller that life could offer. If men struggled with physical pain, then women with mental pain. In Victorian England, a woman was bound by hundreds of invisible threads. To be obedient, to be polite, to be clean, to be patient, to be beautiful, to be moral, to be quiet, to be an angel of the house. This sounds beautiful only in theory. In reality, it was a cage. Women suffered from postpartum trauma, loss of children, child mortality was terribly high, beating by their husbands, overwork, depression, anxiety, chronic pain, complete lack of personal freedom. And each of these wounds had the same treatment. Laudanum. If a woman cried, laudanum. If she couldn't sleep, laudanum. If she was staggering from weakness, laudanum. If she was nervous, laudanum. Even mothers gave laudanum to their children to put them to sleep because there was no other way to rest. We should not judge them. They had no choice. These were women who lived in a society where men wrote the rules and women had only to follow. Opium was what finally gave them a few hours of silence. Sailors were the first Britons to bring opium to London as a habit. For them, it was not an evil, not a thing, not an addiction. It was a reminder of home far away. On a ship, opium was a medicine, a sedative, a diversion, a way to forget the horrors of storms, a way to overcome the loneliness of being at sea. The sea is not romance. It is fear, cold, hard work, wounds, the death of comrades, their disappearance among the waves. And at the same time, It is an infinity in which one feels tiny. In large British houses, maids worked from dawn to night. They ironed, washed, cleaned silver, washed linen, served tea, cooked, cleaned, looked after children 40 to 80 hours a week. And this was considered normal. They lived in small rooms under a roof. They slept little. They had minimum wages. They had no right to complain, and laudanum became a quiet lullaby for their fatigue. At first glance, it seemed that upper-class women had an easier life. Silk dresses, drawing rooms, visits, balls, tea rooms, books, music. But silk often hid iron. Ladies lived under the enormous pressure of duty. To be the perfect wife, the perfect mother, the perfect housewife, the perfect moral figure. Their freedom was minimal. Their sexuality was repressed. Their emotions were indecent. Their depression was capricious. Laudanum was always there, in their handbag, on the bedside table, in the dressing table drawer. Victorian children were not children in the modern sense. They worked. They lost loved ones. They suffered from hunger. They had no childhood. And when they cried, they were given Godfrey's cordial, a tincture of opium. Even priests, even believers, even pure in heart. Some of them found in opium not a temptation, but a meditation. They did not see it as evil. They saw it as an instrument of silence. The aristocrats and gentlemen had no material problems, but they had others, a lack of emotional freedom. All these people had different destinies, different sufferings, different defeats. But the reason they turned to opium was the same. They wanted to relax. There was almost never any loud talk in the opium dens of London. People came there not to speak, but to be silent. Not to show themselves, but to disappear in the light of the lamp. Confessions of a Sailor, Thomas Grace. I have been sailing for 40 years. 40. The sea is not a romance, as in pictures. It is big. Sometimes too big for one man. I have seen the sun in the Indian Ocean. I have seen black storms off Cape Town. I have seen men washed overboard by the waves, as simple as someone erasing a note on a blackboard. In those days, we did not smoke opium for fun, for silence. After 2 days without sleep, it was like a mother putting her hands on your back and saying, "Sleep, Thomas. You are alive. Sleep." I know it should not be like this, that you have to hold on to your own strength. But strength also runs out someday. Confessions of Lady Elizabeth Fullerton. My life on the outside is like something out of a picture book. Dresses, tea salons, pianos, dogs' needlework. But you don't know what a burden it is to always smile, as if there was nothing painful in the world. My husband is not bad. He is just cold. We live side by side, like two objects in a living room. Beautiful. We don't spoil anything. But between us is glass. After my daughter died, I couldn't breathe anymore. He said it was female weakness. The doctor gave me laudanum, and I found silence. Confessions of a young bank clerk, James Whitworth's. I work with numbers, 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 numbers. They have no heart. They have no smell. They have no warmth. Every day I sit in a small room full of ink, paper, and clocks. The clock ticks so loudly that sometimes it seems to me that it is ticking inside me. I had a dream. I wanted to be an artist. But my father said, "Artists are starving, go to the bank." I left. Now sometimes I feel as if my life is not my own, as if I am living for someone else. Opium gives me a few hours when my father's voice is finally silent. Confessions of a Mother, Rebecca Layden. I have had 4 children. 3 died before they were 2. I don't cry in front of others. It's not customary. But I cry every night. A neighbor gave me a tincture. She said it was calming, and I fell asleep for the first time in months. I know it is dangerous. I know it can ruin you. But God, how easy it is to not hear the empty crib for even a few hours. Confessions of a young actress, Nell Harper. The stage is a glitter light, applause, and backstage is darkness, fear, insecurity, loneliness. I'm afraid that when I'm 30, I won't be needed anymore. I'm afraid that older actresses are right, that beauty is the currency that depreciates the fastest. The stage doctor gave me laudanum. He said, "This will relieve the tension." And yes, it does. In this room, I'm not an actress. I'm just Nell, and I can afford to be weak. Confessions of a widow. Martha Blackwell. My husband died in a quarry. A rock fell on him. I was left with 3 children. 2 of them died that same year from fever. People say, "Hold on, Martha. God doesn't give you more than you can bear." But I don't want to be stronger. I want someone to tell me that I can be weak. Opium is the only thing that allows me to do that. The common truth from all these voices. When you listen to all these confessions, you understand the main thing. There are no opium people. There are people who suffer, who are tired, who want peace. Opium was not paradise, and it was not hell. It was a room where all those who had no place in the other world came. And now it is dawn. Not a sharp one, not a blinding one, but a slow one. Like in a quiet valley where the sun rises so carefully, as if it does not want to wake someone who has slept too late. Opium has left 2 memories in British history. One loud, political, about wars, trade, imperial rigidity, colonial ambitions. The other, quiet, human, which you find only when you listen to the voices of the night we have spoken of, the second today. About silence, about hearts, about lives that no one has written down in textbooks, about people who were not the main characters of history, but were history itself, because history is not made up of scandals. It is made up of people's thoughts, pains, hopes, fears, and the desire to rest. Even for a moment, the Victorians did not know the word addiction. They only knew fatigue, insomnia, restlessness, pain, melancholy, nerves. And opium was for them what today is sometimes a psychologist, sometimes an antidepressant, sometimes a warm conversation, sometimes a vacation, sometimes an opportunity to say, "I can't take it anymore." It cured and crippled. It gave warmth and took away strength. It gave sleep and caused nightmares. It saved and destroyed. It was a shadow that sometimes reminded of a hug and sometimes of a thief. But people lived in this shadow, and it is they who need to be remembered. In Victorian England, people had to live by rules that were bigger than themselves. To be moral, to be restrained, to be hardworking, to be obligatory, to be correct. And those who did not conform to the rules had to hide them. Therefore, opium turned into a great silence, the one in which everything that could not be shown was hidden. In that silence, women hid their pain, men, their fatigue, workers, their wounds, intellectuals, their doubts, widows, their grief, young girls, their fear, travelers, their loneliness. Opium was not a fashion. It was a silent mirror of an era that did not know how to talk about the real. At the end of the 19th century, the world began to change. Medicine became more precise. Psychology was born. Human consciousness was opened. Opium slowly ceased to be a cure for everything. It became what it was, a powerful substance that requires vigilance, understanding, and respect. The first laws appeared, the first restrictions, the first warnings, the first discussions, the first scientific articles. And the fog began to clear. Not immediately, but steadily. The opium of the Victorian era is not a monument to human weakness. It is a monument to human need for silence. This is a story about how even the harshest eras have their rooms where people speak the truth. In whispers, in the dark, with smoke rising to the ceiling. And if you look closely, in every shadow, in every pattern of smoke, in every crackle of a lamp, you can hear a human voice. A voice that says, I want to be heard, just once, before bed, before dawn.